Caleb Rourke's laugh cut across the yard like a whip crack. He didn't bother lowering his voice. 30 cowboys were watching, and he wanted every one of them to hear. That's who Dane hired. He said it loud enough that the woman climbing down from the supply wagon could not possibly have missed it. Lord Almighty. She can barely carry herself, let alone feed this crew. He turned to the man beside him, grinning wide. We asked for a cook, and he paused, letting the silence do the cruelest work a burden. The laughter spread through the yard like fire through dry grass. Martha Caldwell heard every word. She had heard words like those her entire life. She set her small wooden trunk down in the dust, straightened her back as far as it would go, and looked at the man who had just announced her failure before she'd touched a single pan. She did not cry. She did not answer him. She looked past him toward the kitchen door and started walking. If you've ever been told you were too much of one thing and not enough of another, too slow, too plain, too worn down by the years, then you already know what Martha carried into that yard. And if you've ever watched someone laugh at a person they'd already decided didn't matter, you know exactly what kind of story this is. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to subscribe and follow Martha's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that yard. The Dane Ranch sat on the edge of the eastern Montana Territory in the autumn of 1884, far enough from the nearest town that a man could go 3 weeks without seeing a face he hadn't already memorized. It was not a pretty stretch of land. The grass had been overgrazed along the southern quarter, and the main house did paint badly enough that visitors sometimes asked if anyone still lived there. But it ran cattle, and it ran them in numbers that kept the books from bleeding red, and that was what Everett Dane had built his life around. He had 30 cowboys on the payroll by October, 30 men who ate twice a day, worked from dark to dark, and had the kind of hunger that simple food could not really satisfy. Not because they were particular, but because a man who works that hard needs more than something to fill his stomach. He needs something that feels like it was made for him, something that reminds him he is more than labor. Their last cook, a wiry old man named Fletcher, had died in August. A bad heart, the doctor said. Peaceful, they hoped. Fletcher had been mediocre at his craft, but reliable, and reliability is worth more than most people give it credit for. When he was gone, Everett cycled through 3 temporary arrangements, each worse than the last. By mid-September, the men were eating burned beans and undercooked salt pork, and something one of them had invented by mixing cornmeal with whatever was closest. Morale had turned brittle. Arguments broke out over small things. A fistfight had erupted over a disputed poker hand that, under normal circumstances, would have been laughed off. Everett Dane was not a man who admitted mistakes easily, but he was smart enough to understand that an underfed crew was a dangerous one. He had written to an agency in Helena that placed domestic workers across the territory. He had been specific in his letter: experienced, reliable, someone who could handle volume. 30 men, 2 meals a day, with provisions already strained heading into winter. What the agency sent him was Martha Caldwell. She was 51 years old, a widow out of rural Iowa, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades cooking in places that didn't have enough of anything: boarding houses, mining camps, failed cattle operation outside of Abilene that had burned to the ground in a summer storm, carried the evidence of hard years in her frame, in the way she moved, in the permanent tiredness around her eyes that never quite disappeared even when she smiled. She was a large woman, and she had never pretended otherwise, and she had spent enough of her life watching other people decide who she was from 10 feet away that she had learned not to fight the first impression. You couldn't win that battle. You could only outlast it. The wagon that brought her out from the train station dropped her in the yard just after noon. Sky was high and pale, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look a little bleached, and the dust from the wagon wheels hadn't fully settled when Caleb Rourke opened his mouth. Caleb was 29 years old, lean and brown from weather, with the kind of confidence that accumulates in men who have never been seriously wrong about anything that mattered. He had been foreman at the Dane Ranch for 2 years, and he ran a tight operation, which was true. And he had a gift for reading people's usefulness at a glance, which he believed was true, and which was the most dangerous kind of mistake a capable man can make. He looked at Martha, stepping down from that wagon, and he saw everything he needed to see. He saw a woman who moved slowly, a woman whose clothing was worn and plain, a woman who was, in his careful estimation, The wrong size for the work, the wrong age for the pace, and the wrong kind of person entirely for a ranch that needed feeding on a frontier schedule. He didn't think he was being cruel. He thought he was being practical. That was the thing about men like Caleb. The cruelty and the practicality had gotten so tangled together in his mind that he couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. Martha heard the laughter follow her to the kitchen door, put her hand on the latch, and paused for just a moment, not from hesitation, but because she was taking stock. That was something she did without thinking, had been doing it so long it was as natural as breathing. Cataloged the yard the way a general catalogues a battlefield, the shape of the outbuildings, the condition of the wood stacked by the side wall, the water situation, the look on the faces of the men who were watching her. Most of them looked entertained. A few of them looked a little ashamed. Those were the ones she noted. She pushed the door open and went inside. Kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something, because she had expected it to be bad. It was a large room. That was its only virtue. There was a wide cast iron stove against the far wall, solid enough despite the rust collecting along its lower seams, and a long preparation table down the center that had clearly been scrubbed within the last week by someone who didn't know what they were doing, but had tried. The shelves were nearly bare. There were sacks of flour and cornmeal, a jug of molasses, some dried beans that looked like they'd been there since Fletcher died, and a half-empty tin of lard. The pantry door was hanging slightly off its top hinge. She opened it anyway. Empty, or close enough to empty that the distinction didn't help. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. She had learned over the years that despair was a luxury she could not afford. It wasn't that she didn't feel it. She felt it the way she felt cold. It was real. It had weight. It moved through her when conditions were right. But she had also learned that despair, like cold, didn't have to be the last word. You could feel it and still build a fire. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook near the door. She found an apron rolled up on the lowest shelf, stiff with old starch, and she shook it out and tied it around herself. And she began. The first thing she did was look at the stove. It was cold, hadn't been lit since morning, judging by the ash. She rebuilt the fire carefully, not rushing it, feeding it with the smaller pieces of wood she found in the box beside the wall. A fire started wrong costs you an hour. She had made that mistake once in a mining camp outside of Butte when she was 37, and still learning that speed and competence were not always the same thing. While the stove warmed, she went through every shelf again, this time not looking at what was there, but thinking about what could be made from it. The flour was good quality. The lard was still workable. The molasses was fine. The dried beans needed a long soak, longer than she had before supper, but she could begin them now and they'd be ready for tomorrow morning. She found, pushed to the very back of the lower shelf, 3 cans of tomatoes that someone had apparently forgotten entirely. She set those on the table like she'd found currency. She checked the cellar door at the back of the kitchen. The wooden steps were steep and the light was poor. She went down anyway, running her hand along the wall for the lantern she could feel had to be there somewhere, and found it. She lit it with a match from her apron pocket. She always kept matches in her apron pocket, had since Abilene, and held it up. The cellar was not empty. It was not full either, but it was not empty. Someone, Fletcher probably, had put up a good number of jars along the stone shelves, green beans, pickled beets, something that looked like preserves. Some had sealed poorly and couldn't be trusted, but most were fine. There were also 2 cured hams hanging from the ceiling joists, partially wrapped in cloth, that she hadn't expected at all. She stood there for a moment, with the lantern raised, looking at those hams, and something in her chest eased slightly. Not easy, not simple, but possible. She carried what she could up in 2 trips and went back for more. Everett Dane found her there on the second trip, standing halfway up the cellar stairs with her arms full of jarred goods. Quiet man. Everett not shy exactly, but deliberate, in the way that men are who have learned that words cost more than they look. He was 54 years old, a widower of 3 years, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had aged into something more interesting than handsome. He watched her manage the stairs with those jars without offering to help immediately, which was not rudeness but observation. He was seeing how she moved. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. She reached the top step and set the jars carefully on the table. "Your cellar's better stocked than your shelves. Fletcher put things up in the summer. We lost track of what was down there. 2 cured hams and about 40 jars of preserved vegetables," she said. "More than I expected." He looked at the jars on the table, then at her. "Caleb said I know what Caleb said. She didn't say it hard. She said it the way you state weather. It doesn't change the supper situation. Everett was quiet for a moment. Can you feed them tonight? He asked. I can feed them tonight, she said. And I'll need a list of what's coming in the supply wagon and when. 2 weeks, he said, maybe 3. The roads after the last rain, 2 or 3 weeks. She turned back to the table and began organizing what she'd brought up. All right. He watched her for another moment. I was told you have experience. I do. Fletcher was the men liked Fletcher. Fletcher left an empty pantry and a broken hinge on the pantry door, she said without heat. I'm not interested in being Fletcher. I'm interested in feeding your crew. Something moved across Everett Dane's face, surprise, she thought, or maybe the beginning of relief, but she wasn't looking at him closely enough to be certain. He left without further comment, and she got to work. She made bean soup that first night long simmered from the dried beans she'd started soaking the moment she touched the kitchen, supplemented with the tomatoes and what remained of a salt pork side she found wrapped in the cold box near the back wall. She made cornbread in 2 cast-iron pans, both runs, enough for every man to have more than one piece. She found wild onions growing along the creek bed. She'd spotted them from the kitchen window when the light was right, and she put on her coat and went out and pulled a full apron load in the gray afternoon, which earned her looks from the 3 cowboys she passed on the way. They didn't laugh this time. They just watched, uncertain. The soup was good, not remarkable. She hadn't had the materials for remarkable, not yet, but good in the honestest way that food is good when it is made with actual attention, seasoned correctly, thickened right. The cornbread with enough structure to hold together, but not so dense it sat in the stomach like something punitive. When the men came to supper, there was a moment at the beginning where the room was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with manners. It was the quiet of people recalibrating. They'd expected something worse. Caleb sat at the far end of the table and ate without expression, which Martha took as the only acknowledgement she was going to get from him. That was fine. She wasn't cooking for Caleb's approval. She was washing the pans when she became aware that someone was standing in the kitchen doorway. She turned to find a child. The girl was 8 years old, or thereabouts small for her age, with her father's dark hair and a way of holding herself that was very still, very watchful. Martha had heard about her from the wagon driver on the way out. Elsie Dane, the rancher's daughter, hadn't spoken since her mother died 2 years ago. The doctor who'd seen her had used the word selective in a way that made it sound technical, but the wagon driver had translated it more plainly. She stopped talking, and nobody's figured out how to start her again. Martha dried her hands on her apron and did not move toward the girl. She had learned something about grief in her own experience that most people who hadn't lived inside it didn't understand. Grief did not want to be approached directly. Grief needed space and patience and something ordinary happening nearby. Something that said the world is still here, and it still has warmth in it, even if you can't feel it yet. She turned back to the pans. I'm making bread tomorrow morning, she said to the room, not specifically to Elsie, the way you talk when you're thinking aloud. If anyone wants to learn, they're welcome in the kitchen before 6. She did not look at the doorway again. She finished the washing and banked the stove for the night, and when she finally glanced toward the door, the girl was gone. But the next morning, before 6, Martha heard a small sound at the kitchen threshold, and when she turned around, Elsie Dane was standing there in her nightgown and bare feet, watching. Martha handed her a small bowl of flour without comment, and that was how it started. The days that followed had a shape that Martha imposed on them by sheer necessity. She woke before 4 to bank up the stove. Breakfast was ready by 5:30, oatmeal when she had it, eggs when she could get them from the 3 surviving hens in the coop behind the outbuilding, biscuits that she perfected by the 3rd day into something the men ate in ways that were, she noticed, more deliberate. They were tasting them now. They hadn't been tasting the food before. She found other things in the days that followed. She kept looking because looking was the only tool she had. She found a half bushel of dried corn that had rolled behind the cellar shelves and been forgotten. She found wild plums along the creek, small and tart, but salvageable with enough sugar, and she made preserves that took 2 full days and left the kitchen smelling like something had shifted in the universe. She found that the ranch had a milk cow that no one had been consistently using because no one had thought to use her consistently, and she began incorporating that into everything she made. The meals got better. They got better not because Martha suddenly had more resources, but because she kept attending to what she had with a kind of precision that looked effortless and was absolutely not. It was the precision of someone who had spent decades figuring out how to make more from less, not as a philosophy, but as a survival mechanism. It looked like talent. It was actually just a very specific kind of grief that had been converted, over years, into knowledge. Caleb watched. He didn't say anything for a while. He watched the way the men had started to linger after meals, instead of filing out immediately. He watched the way Everett Dane sat a little differently at the table straighter, more present, like a man who had been reminded that he was still living a life, and not just administering one. He watched Elsie appear at the kitchen door each morning, and then inside the kitchen, and then, by the second week, standing next to Martha at the preparation table, with a small wooden spoon in her hand. He watched all of this, and he chose each time to find a reason why it didn't mean what it looked like it meant. Because if it meant what it looked like it meant, then he had been wrong in that yard on the first day, loudly and publicly, in front of every man on the crew. And Caleb Rourke was not a man who had much practice with being wrong. The moment that changed the shape of things between Caleb and the rest of the ranch happened on a Thursday, near the end of the second week. It had been a hard day. 2 steers lost to a fence breach in the south pasture, a half day of riding in cold rain, and a disagreement between 2 of the senior cowboys that had gotten loud enough that Everett himself had stepped in. The men came in to supper wet and exhausted and fraying at the edges. Martha had made a venison stew. One of the younger cowboys, a boy of about 20 named Heck, had brought down a deer that morning, and she had been working the stew since midday low heat, long time, with the wild onions and the preserved tomatoes, and a handful of dried herbs she'd found in a small tin that someone had left on the spice shelf and apparently forgotten. The bread was fresh. There was even a small dish of plum preserves on each end of the table, which was the kind of thing that sounds small but isn't. The men sat down, and for a moment nobody moved. Then Heck, the same boy who'd brought the deer, said quietly to no one in particular, "This is the best meal I've had since I left home." There was a silence, and then someone else said, "Yeah." And someone else said, "Yeah." Caleb's jaw tightened. He picked up his spoon and ate and didn't say anything. But Martha, who was clearing from the far end of the table, saw his face when he thought no one was watching. She didn't feel triumph. She was too tired for triumph. What she felt was something more like recognition. She had seen that expression before, on men who had built their certainty so carefully that a single real contradiction felt like a structural threat. He wasn't done yet, she knew that. He was just beginning. What Caleb did, because he was a practical man who couldn't stand disorder, was look for an angle. He found one the next morning. He came into the kitchen before breakfast, early enough that Martha was still working alone, Elsie not yet arrived, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, without preamble, "You're using the preserved stores faster than we can afford." Martha was shaping biscuit dough. She did not look up. "I'm aware of the inventory," she said. "I'm saying you need to be more careful." "I'm being careful. Careful enough that we've gone through 4 jars of those tomatoes in 2 weeks. Because I've been making food that the men are actually eating," she said. "Cut a biscuit shape and set it on the pan. Before I came, how much were they throwing away?" Pause. "That's not the point," Caleb said. "It's exactly the point," she said, still not looking at him. "Waste is waste, whether it happens in the pot or on the plate. I'm producing less waste, not more." His jaw worked. "Everett gave me responsibility for this ranch's resources, and Everett hired me to feed his crew." She looked up at him then, not with challenge exactly, but with a flatness that was, in its own way, more disconcerting than challenge. "If you'd like to take your concerns to Mr. Dane, I'll pair an accounting of everything I've used, and what condition the men's health and morale were in when I arrived, versus now. We can compare." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb's face did something complicated. "I'm watching you," he said finally. "I know," she said. He left. Martha pressed the next biscuit cutter down into the dough, with perhaps slightly more force than was technically necessary, and allowed herself exactly that much. Elsie arrived at 5:45, as she had every morning for the past week. She had started wearing shoes. Martha didn't remark on the shoes. She handed the girl a bowl and pointed to the dried oats, and Elsie began measuring with a concentration that was complete and earnest, and somehow heartbreaking, because it was the concentration of a child who had decided without telling anyone to be useful. They worked side by side in silence for a while. Then Elsie pointed to the plum preserves jar on the shelf and looked at Martha with a question in her expression. "We've got about 6 jars left," Martha said. "I was going to save them. But I think some things are worth using now instead of later." Elsie considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded. Martha got out a jar and opened it and put a small dish of preserves on the breakfast table, and when the men came in and found it there, a few of them smiled before they even sat down. It was a small thing, but small things were how you rebuilt a house. On the 19th day, Everett Dane came to her after supper. He had been watching Elsie. She could tell watching, the way the girl moved through the kitchen, the way she stayed close to Martha's side, the way she had started making small sounds again. Not words yet, but sounds. Engagement. The particular noise a child makes when they are interested in something and want to ask about it but haven't gotten there yet. He sat down at the kitchen table, which he had not done before. Not while she was there, not while she was working. She used to follow her mother around like that, he said. Martha was drying a pan. I know, she said. She didn't know specifically, but she recognized the shape of it. Everett was quiet for a moment. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Martha said. I just didn't go after her. I let her come. He seemed to sit with that. He started and then stopped. She's coming back, Martha said simply. He looked at the table. I should have been. I didn't know how to, Mr. Dane. She said it not unkindly, but firmly enough that he stopped. You're here now. That's what she needs. Another silence. Mrs. Caldwell. He looked up. I should tell you. I received a letter from the agency before you arrived. They said you'd had some difficulties at your last position. She kept drying the pan. I left my last position, she said. The man who ran the operation made certain conditions that I found unacceptable. That is not a difficulty. That is a decision. Everett nodded slowly. I see, he said. She hung the pan on its hook. I'd like to stay, she said. That's still a consideration. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman he had hired from an agency description, and had not, if he was honest with himself, thought much about as a person. He had thought about the problem she was supposed to solve. He had not thought about who she was. He was thinking about it now, with the lateness of a man who has realized that postponed attention is its own kind of failure. It is, he said. He pushed his chair back and left, and Martha stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, listening to the stove tick as it cooled. She was not safe yet. She knew that. Caleb was still watching. The supplies were still thin. The winter was still coming, and it was coming faster than the supply wagon. And somewhere out in the dining room, she had heard Everett mention to one of the ranch hands that the annual gathering was in 3 weeks. The neighbors, the cattle buyer from the east, the families that the Dane Ranch had obligations to, professional and social, and the kind that built reputations across a territory. 3 weeks. She went to the pantry and stood in the doorway and counted what she had. It was not enough. Not for a gathering. Not for what a gathering like that required. But she had made meals from less than this before. She had fed mining camps in winter when the supply lines were weeks gone. She had stretched a half side of beef across 40 men for 4 days in Abilene, and no one had gone hungry. She knew things about food and hardship that couldn't be read from a cookbook or guessed from looking at her. That was the trouble with being underestimated. You knew things. You had paid over the years a very specific price for those things. And the people who looked at you and decided you were less than you were would never know what that price had been, because they had never had to pay it themselves. Martha Caldwell turned off the kitchen lamp and went to her room. She did not sleep well, but she rarely did. What she did was plan. Plans she had constructed in her head that night, lying awake with the stove's last heat fading through the wall, was not a grand plan. It was the kind of plan that only looks inevitable in retrospect, built from small observations, accumulated quietly over 3 weeks of watching what the ranch had and what it needed, and what the gap between those two things actually contained. 3 weeks until the gathering. Supply wagon still not arrived. Pantry still thin in the ways that mattered most for feeding guests, even if it had improved enough for daily meals. She started the next morning, before anyone else was awake. The first thing she did was take a full accounting, not the quick survey she'd done on arrival, but a deliberate, item-by-item count of everything in the kitchen, the cellar, the cold box, and the outbuildings. She carried a piece of brown paper and a stub of pencil, and she wrote down every jar, every cured pound of meat, every bag of grain. She noted what was in good condition and what was marginal and what needed to be used immediately before it turned. It took her 2.5 hours. When she was done, she sat at the kitchen table with the paper in front of her and looked at what she had. It was not enough for a gathering of the size Everett had described neighbors, a cattle buyer, the families that came in from across the territory for the annual event. But it was more than she'd feared. and fear had a way of making inventories look worse than they were. She had learned that in Abilene, during the bad winter of 1871, when she had convinced herself for 3 days that they would run out of flour before the supply lines reopened, and they had not. She began writing a second list. Not what she had, but what she could make from it. Caleb found her there. He came in from the early morning yard rounds, poured himself a cup of the coffee she'd already made, and stood at the counter looking at the papers spread across the table. He didn't ask what they were. He just looked at them the way a man looks at something he suspects is being done around him rather than with him. Supply wagon's been delayed again, he said. Mudslides on the Eastern Pass. Everett got word last night. Martha looked up. How long? Another 2 weeks minimum. Maybe more. He drank his coffee and watched her face. She knew he was watching for something alarm, maybe, or the crack that would let him say I told you so in the yard all over again. She folded the inventory paper and set it beside her. All right, she said, all right. He repeated it flatly, like he was testing the words for sincerity. The gathering is in 3 weeks. If the wagon doesn't come before then, we're hosting 30 neighbors and a cattle buyer on whatever's in that cellar. I know what's in the cellar, she said. I counted it this morning. And she picked up her pencil. And I have work to do. He set his cup down on the counter with slightly more force than was required and walked out. She went back to her second list. What Martha had understood, from the first day she'd stood in that cellar with the lantern, was something that people who grew up with abundance tended to miss entirely. Scarcity has a logic to it, and if you follow that logic carefully enough, it opens doors that a full pantry never would. When you have everything, you cook what the recipe calls for. When you have almost nothing, you are forced to understand what food actually is, what makes it satisfying, what makes it feel like care rather than mere fuel, what a person is actually tasting when they eat something and feel, without being able to articulate why, that someone made it for them. She had learned that in her first boarding house job, at 32, when the owner had understocked the kitchen by half because he'd spent the budget on a new horse and expected her to manage. She had been furious that first week. And then she had started cooking differently, and something had shifted, and by the third week, the boarders were telling their friends about the meals, and she had learned something she never entirely forgot. Now she applied that same logic to the Dane Ranch's situation, but with a precision she hadn't had at 32. She knew she could make real bread, not the flat emergency cornbread she'd been producing for daily use, but the kind of bread that rose properly and had a crust that sounded right when you tapped it, and a crumb that pulled apart in a way that made people stop talking. She had the flour for it if she rationed carefully. She knew she could make a proper beef stew from the lesser cuts that were hardest to sell and easiest to overlook, the shanks, the necks, the tough shoulder pieces that needed a full day's low heat to become what they were capable of being. She knew she could make something from the preserved vegetables that read as intentional rather than desperate if she thought about the layering carefully. But the thing she was most focused on, the thing that kept her up thinking past the point where thinking was useful, was the gathering itself. Because a gathering wasn't really about the food. It was about what the food said. She was turning this over in her mind on the afternoon of the 21st day when Heck appeared at the kitchen doorway. He was the youngest of the ranch hands, the one who'd said it was the best meal he'd had since home, and he had the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like yet. "Ma'am," he said. "Heck." I was down at the creek checking the fence line, and he stopped. He was holding something behind his back, which he now brought forward. It was a cloth sack, and it was full of something that clinked gently when he moved. There's wild plums still on the east side. I found some late-season gooseberries. And these. He held up the sack, and she could see through the cloth that it was full of small mushrooms. My grandmother used to dry those and use them in stew. Martha looked at the sack. She had been calculating, just now, what she was short of, and mushrooms had been one of the items she'd been trying to solve. "Is your grandmother a good cook?" she asked. Heck smiled a quick, slightly embarrassed thing. "Best I ever knew. Then she taught you something worth knowing." She took the sack from him. "Can you find more of these?" "Probably. The East Bank has a long stretch of them. I need them dried by next week. Do you know how to do that?" He nodded. "String them and hang them near heat. My grandmother kept them over the hearth." "Talk to me before you hang them anywhere near my stove," she said. "But yes, the method." She set the sack on the table. "Thank you." He started to leave. "Heck," he turned back. "Tell me something." The men who've been here longest, do they know this territory? The surrounding land? Sure. Most of them grew up out here. Is there anyone who knows where to find things? Not game. Plants. What's still growing at this time of year, where the natural stands are? He thought about it. Old Pete might. He's been on this range longer than anyone. He knows every creek and draw for 20 miles. Ask him if he'd be willing to talk to me, she said. Old Pete was 63 and had the weathered economy of a man who had spent the better part of 4 decades saying only what was necessary and nothing more. Came to the kitchen the next morning, hat in hand, and sat across the table from Martha with the careful alertness of someone who has been told there's a specific reason for the conversation and is waiting to find out what it is. Told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting. Watercress, he said when she finished. Comes up late along the cold sections of the creek. Still, some going in the sheltered bend north of the second fence line. Wild onion, you already know about. There's a stand of cattails in the marshy ground east of the old hay barn. The lower part of the root is edible if you know what to do with it. And there's juniper, obviously, which you probably don't want for cooking, but the berries flavor meat if you use them careful. Martha was writing. Juniper berries with venison, she said. Yes, I know that. What else? Roships along the south fence. Plenty of them. Late in the season, but still good. Roships. She wrote that down too. I can make a syrup. Old Pete watched her write with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something privately. You're trying to feed the gathering from what's on the land, he said. Not a question. I'm trying to supplement what's in the cellar, she said. The supply wagon is delayed. He was quiet for a moment. I know places, he said slowly, that the other men don't bother with because they don't see the use. If you wrote a list of what you need, I could look. She looked up from her paper. I'd be grateful, she said. He nodded once, took his hat, and left, and Martha thought that this was how things actually got done. Not through grand gestures or formal arrangements, but through one person asking for help in a way that made it possible for another person to say yes. Caleb found out about Old Pete the following afternoon. He came to Martha after supper. The men had dispersed. Everett had gone to the study. Elsie had followed her father as she'd started to do in the evenings, a development that Martha considered the most significant thing that had happened on the ranch since she'd arrived. And he stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was specifically the expression of a man who has been told something third-hand and has arrived to confront it. You sent Pete out on foraging duty, he said. I asked Pete if he'd be willing to help me identify what's still growing on the land. She was scrubbing the large stew pot back to him. He volunteered. Pete has work to do. He's got fence repairs on the south pasture, and he went out this morning before his fence repairs, and he came back with roships and late-season watercress and 3 kinds of edible mushroom. She set the pot down. He was back by 9 o'clock. His fence work wasn't scheduled until noon. A pause. You're getting cozy with my crew, Caleb said. The word cozy landed with an edge that was meant to be contemptuous. Martha turned around. Your crew, she said, was eating burned beans 2 months ago. I'm not getting cozy with them. I'm doing my job, and part of my job, the part that keeps 30 men healthy through a Montana winter, is knowing what resources are available and using them. Pete knows this land better than any map I could consult. Talking to him is not sentiment. It's practical. Caleb's jaw tightened in the way it did when he'd found a position and couldn't quite hold it. The gathering, he said, shifting. Everett needs to consider postponing it, between you and Mr. Dane. I'm telling Everett it should be postponed. We can't host 40 people on cellar stores and foraged mushrooms. You haven't tasted the mushrooms yet, she said. Martha. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, not sharp, just exact. Another silence. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, and the correction had cost him something. She could see that. I'm trying to protect this ranch's reputation. If we host that gathering and the table is inadequate, then you're right to be concerned, she said. But you're making an assumption about the table, and you don't have the information to support that assumption yet. I have eyes. You have an opinion, she said. That's a different thing. He stood there for a moment longer, and she held his gaze without difficulty, because she had learned in boarding houses and mining camps, and that terrible year in Abilene, that the moment you looked away from a man like Caleb was the moment he decided he had won something. He left without another word. She turned back to the pot. Her hands were shaking slightly. They did that sometimes, after a confrontation. Not from fear. She had passed through fear of men like Caleb sometime around her 40s, but from the sustained energy of holding herself together through something she would rather not have had to do at all. She finished the scrubbing and dried her hands and allowed herself 30 seconds of standing very still before she went back to planning. Elsie had started speaking again. Not fully, not in sentences. But sounds had become single words, and single words had started occasionally linking to form short phrases. The kind that children use when they are testing the mechanism, checking whether the language still works before committing to it fully. The first clear word Martha had heard her speak was more. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning Martha had been making porridge and had given Elsie a small bowl first, to check the sweetness level, the way she sometimes did. Elsie had eaten it standing at the counter, and when it was gone, she had held out the empty bowl and said, clearly and without hesitation, more. Martha had given her more, without making anything of it, but she had felt something move in her chest that she would have been embarrassed to name. The second word was hot, said in warning when Martha had almost reached for a pan that had been left too close to the stove edge. And then, later that same week, I know 2 words, said in response to Martha explaining how to fold bread dough, spoken with the slightly put-up-on air of a child who has been shown something and is diplomatically indicating that they had in fact figured it out themselves. Martha had suppressed a smile. She had also started leaving small things for Elsie to do that were real tasks, not the simplified busywork that adults give children to make them feel included, but actual parts of the production, measuring, timing. The specific job of checking the bread loaves to tell Martha when the tops were the right color, which required a judgment call rather than a rule, and which Elsie took seriously in a way that was, Martha thought, exactly the right response to being trusted with something genuine. Everett had started spending more time in the kitchen in the evenings. He never stayed long. He would come in for coffee. Martha had started keeping a small pot warm until late, and he would sit at the corner of the table and not quite participate in whatever was happening, but not quite absent himself from it either. Sometimes Elsie was still there, and the 2 of them would sit in the same room in a companionable quiet that Martha recognized as its own kind of conversation. Kind that 2 people have when they've been circling each other at a careful distance and have finally found a way to exist in the same space without either of them feeling the need to explain themselves. She didn't insert herself into those moments. She made coffee and moved around the kitchen doing the last things that needed doing, and she was aware, without looking directly at it, that something was slowly repairing itself in the room. On the morning of the 25th day, old Pete came back from a longer excursion with 2 other men, Wills and Bose, both senior hands who had apparently decided to make an event of it, and they brought back more than she'd expected. Wild garlic from the sheltered creek draw, a full basket of late rose ships, far more than she'd hoped for. Several pounds of dried mushrooms that Pete had strung and left in the sun at a location he'd checked periodically for the past week. And this surprised her, a large quantity of wild sage, which she hadn't asked for, but which was the kind of find that changed a recipe's entire character if you knew what to do with it. She knew what to do with it. She thanked them with the sincerity of someone for whom the gratitude was entirely practical, which they seemed to understand was more real than elaborateness would have been. That afternoon she made a small test dish with the sage and some of the lesser beef cuts that she'd been reserving for exactly this kind of experimentation, a long braise with the wild garlic and dried mushrooms and a small amount of the molasses too. Balance the bitterness, and she let it go for most of the afternoon on the back of the stove. Around 4 o'clock, Heck appeared in the kitchen doorway, visibly drawn by the smell. "What is that?" he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Something I'm testing. Can I—" "No." She pulled a small piece of the braised meat out of the pot and set it on a plate and handed it to him. "Tell me what you think." He ate it with the focused expression of someone trying to be honest rather than polite. "Tastes like it took all day," he said. "It did," she said. He paused, searching. "It tastes like someone cared a lot about making it." She took the plate back from him and turned back to the stove. That was exactly what she needed to know. 4 days before the gathering, Caleb went to Everett. Martha knew about it the same way she knew about most things on the ranch, not through eavesdropping, but through the simple fact that the ranch house was not large, and conversations that happened in the study, with the door partly open, carried to the kitchen if the stove wasn't running loud. She heard Caleb's voice, steady and certain, laying out his position. The supply wagon had not come. The stores were inadequate. The risk to the ranch's reputation was real, and the responsible decision was to send riders out to the neighbors today and postpone the gathering until the supplies arrived. She heard Everett's silence. Then Everett said, "What does Mrs. Caldwell say?" A pause. I haven't asked Mrs. Caldwell, Caleb said. Maybe you should. Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of Caleb's boots on the study floor, and Martha picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter, and 30 seconds later Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her for a moment. Everett wants to know if you can manage the gathering, he said. He said it flatly, without inflection, which was the only way he could say it without it feeling like it cost too much. She set the cloth down. I can manage it, she said, on what we have. On what we have, she said, plus what's been collected. And I'll need the men to help me build 2 additional fire pits in the yard, because I can't run everything through one stove. A very long pause. 2 fire pits, Caleb repeated. Outdoor cooking. I'm planning a roast for the main course. The large beef cuts I've been holding back. If I have outdoor heat, I can manage the timing across everything without bottlenecking on the stove. He stared at her. You've been planning this, he said, since the first morning. I've been planning this since I counted the inventory, she said, which I did on my first full day. Something moved across his face, too fast to read clearly, but she thought it was the specific expression of a man who has been outthought by someone he had decided couldn't think. I'll get the men on the fire pits, he said. He left. Martha breathed out slowly and went back to her counter. 3 days before the gathering had a quality of intensity that she had not felt since the worst of the Abilene period. Not the same kind of intensity, because that had been desperation, and this was something more like concentrated will, but the same compression of time and energy into a single purpose. She was in the kitchen by 3:30 each morning. She made bread every day, 3 full batches, which she wrapped and stored in the coolest part of the cellar to keep fresh. She rendered the fat from the cured hams, which gave her cooking medium and added flavor to everything it touched. She made the rosehip syrup too, full jars of it, and a preserved plum sauce that she intended for the bread, which she tested on Heck and Old Pete and received back serious nods that told her it was right. She worked the beef cuts in the cold box, seasoning them 2 days ahead so the salt and the wild sage had time to penetrate. She prepared the mushroom-based gravy base a day in advance, letting it develop overnight. She mapped out the timing for the gathering day itself with the same precision she'd once used to feed a mining camp of 45 men across 3 shifts on a 4-hour rotation, because the principle was the same. Everything had to be ready at the right time, and the way you ensured that was by working backward from the moment of service and accounting for every variable you could foresee. Elsie helped. She helped with the focus of a child who understood, without having it explained, that something important was happening. She measured and stirred and watched the bread and reported the color of the crust with the exact language Martha had taught her. Not yet, almost. Now, and she did not talk more than was useful, which turned out to be a useful quality in a kitchen that was operating at capacity. On the night before the gathering, Everett came to the kitchen late. Martha was finishing the last of the preparations, checking her timing sheets, making sure the morning sequence was clear in her head. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. Caleb thinks you're going to pull this off, he said. Duh. Caleb said that? Not in so many words, a small pause. He said the fire pits were well positioned and the timing plan was, I believe solid was the word. Caleb, that is approximately a declaration of respect. Martha considered this. He's a capable man, she said. He is, Everett agreed. He's also a man who isn't used to being wrong. Nobody is, she said. That doesn't make them irredeemable. Everett looked at her for a moment. Why aren't you angrier at him? After what he said when you arrived. She thought about how to answer that. Because anger takes energy, she said finally, and I've needed the energy for other things. And because she paused, I've spent enough of my life being angry at men who made up their minds about me before I could open my mouth. It's a real feeling, and it's fair, but it doesn't change the meal. He was quiet. What does change the meal? She said, turning back to her papers, is 35 years of knowing what I'm doing. She heard him move and then pause. Mrs. Caldwell, Mr. Dane, thank you, he said, for all of it. She didn't look up. We'll see how tomorrow goes, she said. She heard him leave, and the house settled into quiet around her, and she sat with her timing sheets and the lamplight and the sound of the Montana wind, finding the gaps in the kitchen wall, and she did not let herself think about what happened if she'd miscalculated somewhere. She thought instead about the morning sequence. 3:30 fire pits lit, bread into the oven. 4 o'clock. Beef onto the outdoor spits. The rest would follow from there, piece by piece, the way everything did when you had built the structure carefully enough. She folded the timing sheet and put out the lamp. She was awake at 3:15, which was 15 minutes ahead of the timing sheet, because she had not actually slept. She had lain in the dark and run the sequence forward in her head so many times that by 2 o'clock she had stopped pretending the rest was coming and simply waited for the hour when she could get up and begin. That was a thing she had learned about herself over the years, that the night before something large, she became useless for sleep, but useful for thinking, and the only productive response was to stop fighting the first and let the second run its course. By 3:15, she had already settled 3 small decisions she'd left open the night before. The rosehip syrup would go on the table at the start, not the end. It was distinctive enough to set a tone, and she wanted the tone set early, before people had formed their impressions. The mushroom gravy would be served separately in its own dish, rather than poured over the beef, because the quality of both things was better experienced with some choice between them. And the bread 3 full batches, wrapped in the cellar. She would warm the last batch in the oven during the final hour, so the smell would be in the air when people were already seated. Smell was the sense people forgot to account for. It arrived before everything else and set the expectation. And if the expectation was right, the actual food had less work to do. Dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. The fire pits were cold and needed rebuilding from ash. That was the first thing, and it was the hardest physical work of the morning carrying wood in the dark. Arranging it correctly, coaxing a fire that would be steady and manageable rather than fast and hot, because what she needed was sustained heat over hours, and not a blaze that would char the outside of the beef before the inside was ready. She had done this before, in different configurations. An open fire was less predictable than a stove, but it was also more honest. It told you immediately when you'd made a mistake, without the buffer that cast iron provided. She respected that. By 3:50 both pits were going. She stood back and looked at them in the dark. 2 low orange pools of light in the ranch yard, and she was aware of how cold it was. The temperature had dropped overnight, properly cold now. Montana in October cold that found the gap between your collar and your hat. And she thought that the cold, which she had been worried about as a variable, was actually going to work in her favor. The guests would come in from the cold and the fire, and the smell of the bread and the warmth of the main room would hit them immediately. And warmth, after cold, is a form of welcome that doesn't need words. She went back inside. By 5 o'clock, the bread was in the oven, and the beef cuts 3 large pieces, seasoned 2 days ago, tied the way she'd learned from a woman in a Kansas boarding house who had learned it from her mother, where on the outdoor spits, rotating on the slow hand-cranked mechanism that Wills and Dubose had rigged from materials in the equipment barn. She had shown them exactly what she needed. They had built it with the competence of men who had spent their lives solving practical problems with available materials, and she had said thank you in a way that they had nodded at without comment, because that was how gratitude worked on a working ranch. It was real or it wasn't, and if it was, you didn't need to say much. Elsie appeared at 5:15. Martha had not expected her had actually decided, the night before, that she would not ask Elsie to help with the gathering day itself, because she hadn't wanted to put that particular pressure on a child who was still in the early stage of returning to herself. But Elsie arrived in her better dress, with her hair brushed, carrying herself with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the organized chaos of the preparation. The cooling bread, the pots already on the stove, the measuring and sorting happening across the full length of the table, and then she walked in and put her apron on. Martha didn't say anything. She handed Elsie the spoon for the mushroom base and pointed to the pot on the back burner. "Slow circles," she said. "Don't let it catch on the bottom." Elsie nodded and took the spoon, and that was that. The guests were expected from mid-morning. In a territory this spread out, people traveled the night before when they could, or started well before dawn, and arrival was less a fixed time than a range. You prepared for the first person at 1 hour and the last person 2 hours later, and you built that gap into everything. Martha had built it in. What she had not built in, because she had not known about it until Heck told her at 6:30, was the additional party. "Everett got word last night," Heck said. He was on one of the outdoor fire rotations. She'd asked 3 of the men to take turns on the spits in 90-minute shifts, and he'd come inside to warm his hands between the crank and the morning's first coffee. The Alderman family from over in the valley is coming. They weren't on the original list. Martha set down what she was holding. "How many in the Alderman family?" She said Mr. and Mrs. Alderman and their Heck counted on his fingers in the way people do when they're not entirely sure. "I think 5 children. And they're bringing a ranch hand as driver. So, eight additional people. She stood there for a moment with the specific stillness of someone running a calculation that doesn't quite balance. Is this confirmed? She said. Everett mentioned it at breakfast. He thought you knew. I did not know, she said. She turned back to the table and began moving things, mentally redistributing portions, thinking about which elements of the meal could stretch and which had been sized too precisely. The bread could stretch, could produce another partial batch in the time remaining, a faster method that wouldn't be quite as good but would be adequate and indistinguishable to anyone who hadn't tasted the originals. The beef could stretch, barely, if she used the carved portions carefully and supplemented with the preserved ham she'd been holding back as a secondary option. The mushroom gravy was already more than she'd planned, because she'd made extra as insurance. Problem was the table itself, the number of seats, the dishes, the impression of plenty that she needed to create for 40-plus people from what was, even with everything she'd gathered and prepared, a finite amount. Called Heck back before he went out. Tell Everett I need to speak with him when he has 10 minutes, she said. Yes, ma'am. And tell him it's not an emergency, she added. Just a conversation. She did not want Everett coming into the kitchen with alarm on his face. Alarm was contagious, and she had a kitchen to run. Everett came at 7. He came in with the specific expression of a man who had realized, somewhere between the message and the kitchen door, that he had made an error of omission and was trying to decide how to frame it. I should have told you last night, he said immediately. Yes, she agreed. The aldermans. Our Thomas Alderman is a significant figure in the county. When he indicated he was coming, I couldn't, Mr. Dane. She looked at him levelly. I'm not upset about the guests. I'm upset about the information. There is a difference. He absorbed this. What do you need? He said. I need whatever is in the cold box at the main house that you've been holding back, she said. She had suspected there was something. A man like Everett Dane did not reach the gathering season without some reserves set aside, even if the reserves were thin. I need an honest accounting, right now, of anything I haven't been told about. Pause. There's a smoked side of venison, he said slowly. I was keeping it, for there's also a crock of pickled eggs from the summer, and some dried apple rings that Elsie's grandmother sent before she-thos were in the house pantry. Get them, Martha said. He went. She turned back to the table and began rebuilding the plan in her head, incorporating the new pieces, adjusting, finding the shape that now existed, rather than the shape she'd been working toward. This was the part that people who had never run a kitchen under pressure didn't understand about cooking. The plan was not the cooking. The plan was the starting point from which all the real decisions diverged, and the quality of the cook was visible not in whether they could execute the plan, but in whether they could navigate every moment when the plan met reality and was changed by it. Everett came back with the smoked venison, the crock, and a bag of dried apple rings that smelled like someone's memory. Anything else? Martha asked. He thought. There's a wheel of hard cheese in the cellar that I completely forgot about. I think Fletcher put it up in July. Get that too, she said. And then stay out of the kitchen until I send for you. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Caleb arrived at 7:40. She heard him before she saw him. His boots on the porch boards had a particular rhythm she'd learned to recognize, and she did not stop what she was doing when he came through the door. Heck told me about the aldermans, he said. Then you know the situation. I told you the table was going to be tight. He crossed his arms. 8 extra people. I'm aware of the arithmetic, she said. I've adjusted. Adjusted how? You've already used. There's smoked venison from the main house pantry, a wheel of hard cheese I didn't know about, dried apples, and pickled eggs. She was moving as she talked, hands never stopping. I'm adding a second bread batch. I'm slicing the beef thinner and carving it at the table instead of serving it pre-portioned, which means people take what they need rather than what they're handed, and it will look more abundant and actually stretch further. I'm putting the cheese out with the rosehip syrup as a first course, which gives the beef more time and creates the impression of a longer, more generous meal. Caleb was quiet. The dried apple rings, she continued, are going into a skillet dessert with the last of the molasses and some of the wild sage butter I made yesterday. It's not a proper pie, but it will smell like one, and it will taste like someone cared, which is 3/4 of what dessert actually is. More quiet. You had a contingency, he said finally. I had several, she said. I always have several. He stood there for a moment with his arms still crossed, but the set of his shoulders had changed slightly. Some things had shifted in the architecture of his position. Some load-bearing certainty had moved. The two front tables need to be extended, he said. There's a wide plank in the equipment barn that would work for a trestle. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That would help. He uncrossed his arms. He left without another word, and she heard him calling to Wills and DeBose in the yard, directing them to the barn, and she turned back to the stove. The first guests arrived at 9:40, the Perkins family from the North Range, who had ridden through a cold morning and arrived red-faced and grateful for the fire. Then the Harmon brothers, who ran the adjacent cattle operation and had a complicated financial relationship with Everett that Martha understood existed but didn't know the details of. Then a party from the southern settlement that she didn't know by name. And at 10:15, the cattle buyer. His name was Theodore Marsh, and Martha knew he was significant from the way Everett's posture changed when the man rode into the yard. Marsh was from the East Kansas City, she thought she'd heard, and he had the particular manner of a man who had money and was accustomed to using it as a form of attention. He was not unpleasant, from what she could observe through the kitchen window, but he was assessing. He looked at the ranch the way an auditor looks at a ledger cataloging, measuring, forming conclusions. He would do the same with the meal. She knew that, and she was prepared for it. And she also knew that prepared and ready were related but not identical, and that the gap between them was where things went wrong. She went back to the bread. The Alderman family arrived at 11, 8 of them filing into the yard in a configuration that involved several children who immediately ran in directions their parents did not intend, which is what children do when they have been in a wagon for 2 hours and suddenly encounter open space. Thomas Alderman himself was a broad man, loud in the way that men are when they have been told, enough times, that their opinions are worth hearing. His wife, Clara, was quieter and had the look of a woman who had learned to navigate around her husband's volume without drawing attention to the act of navigation. Everett moved through the guests with the effort of a man who is not naturally gregarious but understands its necessity. He was doing his best. Martha could see that from the brief intervals when she allowed herself to look up from the kitchen. Caleb was managing the yard, directing where horses were tied, where the men gathered, keeping the social mechanics running in the way that a foreman manages anything, which is to say, through a combination of competence and low-level intimidation. Elsie was standing near her father. That was new. She had, for the past 2 years, Martha had been told, avoided gatherings, entirely retreated to her room, or to the far pasture, or to any space where there were fewer people, and therefore fewer of the particular ache that came from being around people who looked at her with a pity she could feel but couldn't address. But this morning she was standing near Everett, not touching him, not speaking, but present, watching. Martha turned back to her work before she could feel too much about that. The meal was scheduled for noon. At 11:20, something went wrong with one of the fire pits. The wind had been picking up since mid-morning, not dramatically, not the kind of wind that warranted concern, but it had been shifting direction every half hour in the unpredictable way of October winds in Montana. And at 11:20 it found the second fire pit from the northwest and pushed the heat sideways for long enough that the spit rotation, which depended on even heat distribution on both sides, was disrupted. Wills, who was on the second pit rotation, caught it and called out. Martha was out the kitchen door in 30 seconds. She looked at the fire and the meat and the direction the wind was coming from and made 3 decisions simultaneously. The second pit's beef needed to come off the spit 15 minutes early and finish in the kitchen oven, which meant rearranging the oven timing. The first pit was unaffected and could stay, and the supplementary venison, which she'd planned to serve warm, could serve as cold sliced if she lost the oven window she needed. Told Wills exactly what to do and how to do it. He did it. She went back inside and reconfigured the oven timing, and pulled the partially done bread to the warming shelf, and made room and managed the transition in the 13 minutes she had before the early removed beef needed to go in. Heck appeared at her elbow with the expression of someone who wants to help and doesn't know how. Stand by that oven door, she told him, and tell me exactly what the meat looks like every 3 minutes. Don't touch it. Just look and tell me. What am I looking for? Color of the outside, and whether the fat is rendering, she said. You'll know rendering when you see it. It'll look wet and glossy. He stationed himself at the oven with the solemnity of a man given a post. Martha went back to the stovetop. At 11:40, Caleb came into the kitchen. He looked at the situation, the revised timing, Heck at the oven, Elsie at the mushroom pot, the bread on the warming shelf, Martha running 3 things at once, and he said nothing for a moment. Then what do you need? She didn't look up. Someone to slice the cheese. Thin, uniform thickness, arranged on the board with the rosehip syrup in a small dish in the center. It goes out to the side table in, she checked the clock, 8 minutes. I can do that, he said. The board is on the shelf behind you. The cheese wheel is wrapped in cloth. Use the long knife, not the short one. He found the board and the cheese and began working. She could hear the knife on the cheese behind her, and the pace of it told her he was taking it seriously, not rushing, keeping the thickness even. This? He asked after a minute. She glanced back. Bit thinner, she said. He adjusted. She turned back to the stove. They worked in parallel for the next 8 minutes without speaking, and it was the most functional the kitchen had been since she'd arrived. And neither of them acknowledged that. Caleb carried the cheese board out at 11:50. Martha heard the first sounds of reaction from the main room. Not words, but the quality of noise changed. The particular murmur of people who have been given something unexpected in a pleasant direction. She allowed herself 3 seconds of that. Then the oven needed checking, and she was back. At noon, with the kind of punctuality that is not luck, but the product of a great deal of calculation that looks like luck, the meal was ready. She stood at the kitchen door for a moment and looked at what had been produced. The beef both pieces, the spit finished, and the oven finished was, resting on the large board she'd designated for carving, the surface appropriately dark with the sage and the rendered fat and the hours it had taken. The mushroom gravy was deep and rich and smelled like something old and serious. Bread the original batches, plus the emergency batch which had come out better than she'd expected because she'd added a small amount of the wild garlic to the dough, was wrapped in cloth and warm. The venison was sliced thin on its own board. The pickled eggs were in a shallow bowl with a small bunch of dried herbs she'd set beside them for appearance. The apple dessert was in the oven on low heat, filling the kitchen with a smell that was, she had to admit, the best thing in the room. It was not perfect. The second beef piece was fractionally less developed on one side than she'd wanted, because the wind had taken 8 minutes from it. The emergency bread, despite the garlic improvement, had a slightly denser crumb than the originals. There was less gravy than she'd planned for, because she'd underestimated the mushroom reduction by roughly a quarter. Catalogued these things not with distress but with the same inventory habit that had gotten her through the first morning clear-eyed, practical, noted and then set aside, because the time for fixing was over and the time for serving had arrived. Elsie, she said. Elsie looked up from the pot. Go find your father, Martha said. Tell him the meal is ready. Elsie set down the spoon with care and took off her apron and smoothed her dress with both hands in a gesture so instinctively adult that Martha felt something catch in her chest. The girl went. They filed in, 43 people. By Martha's count, she had counted them through the kitchen window during the late morning, and the room that normally held 30 ranch hands at 2 long tables was now extended with Caleb's trestle plank and every chair on the property, arranged with the haphazard practicality of a space that was doing more than it was designed to do and doing it adequately. Martha stood at the far side of the kitchen doorway, where she could see the tables without being the center of attention, which was exactly where she wanted to be. The first response was from the Perkins family. The mother, specifically, a woman who had clearly been cooking for a large household for decades and recognized what she was seeing in the same way that one craftsman recognizes another's work. She said something to her husband, quiet, and he looked at the table and nodded. Thomas Alderman sat down, looked at the spread, and said nothing for a moment, which, in a man whose default was volume, was its own form of statement. Theodore Marsh, the cattle buyer, seated himself at the right side of the main table. He looked at the cheese board, the rosehip syrup, the bread, all of it still out from the first course. And then he looked around the room in the way that people from cities look around rooms when they are recalibrating their expectations. Everett stood at the head of the table. He looked across the room and found Martha in the kitchen doorway, and something passed between them. Not a long look, just a moment of acknowledgement, the kind that says, I see what you've done here, without requiring an audience. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned to his guests. Please, he said simply, and the meal began. Martha did not sit. She had never sat at the meals she served, not in 35 years of cooking, and she did not intend to start now. She moved through the kitchen and the peripheral spaces, watching the table without appearing to watch, noting where the bread was going faster than expected and sending heck for more, seeing that the mushroom gravy was being used heavily and moving it to a more central position, observing that Thomas Alderman had taken 2 portions of the beef, which told her something about how it had landed, and that Theodore Marsh had eaten the cheese first, and then the bread, and then looked at the bread again in the specific way of someone deciding whether it would be unseemly to take more. She sent more bread. Caleb appeared at her elbow around the midpoint of the meal. "Alderman is asking about the mushroom gravy," he said quietly. "His wife wants to know the method. Tell her it's a long reduction with wild mushrooms and beef stock, and she's welcome to come talk to me after the meal," Martha said. Caleb hesitated. "She's the kind of woman who expects people to come to her," he said. Martha looked at him. "Then she can expect that," she said pleasantly. "And I'll be in the kitchen." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but it was closer than anything that had crossed his face in her direction since she'd arrived. He went back to the table. It was Elsie who broke the afternoon open. Martha had not planned for it. Nobody had planned for it. It happened the way things happen when a child decides, in the interior space where children make real decisions, that the moment is right. The meal had reached its later stage. The apple dessert had come out of the oven and was being passed around the table. And the room had the quality that good meals create in rooms, which is a kind of settled warmth, a slowing down, temporary agreement among strangers that the world outside can wait. When Elsie stood up, she was sitting next to her father, which she had moved to do approximately halfway through the meal, a quiet migration that Everett had absorbed without comment. She stood up from her chair, and the room did not immediately notice, because children stand up from chairs, and it is not generally significant. Then she began to speak. Her voice was small, not inaudible. The room had quieted by coincidence in the moment she started, the way rooms sometimes do. Small, with the particular quality of a voice that has not been used in a long time and is finding its way back to itself. "Mrs. Martha made everything," she said. The room was still now, all of it. She made the bread and the gravy and the apples, and Elsie paused, and in the pause she seemed to gather something, standing very straight with her hands at her sides, and she made me feel like I could talk again. Silence. Not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of a room that has been stopped by something real. Martha, standing in the kitchen doorway, found that she needed to look at the doorframe for a moment. Everett was looking at his daughter with an expression that was multiple things at once: grief and love, and something that had been locked away for a long time, and was finding its way to the surface in the least private moment possible. His jaw was tight, his eyes were bright. Clara Alderman put her hand over her mouth. Theodore Marsh set down his fork. Elsie sat back down, apparently satisfied, and picked up her spoon again, as if she had simply stated a fact that needed stating, and the matter was now complete. Martha looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds before she trusted herself to look at the room again. Then she turned back to the stove, because there was coffee to make, and the moment needed space around it, and her presence in the doorway was one too many things in the room right then. Thomas Alderman was the first to speak, and what he said was not what Martha expected. He said, "Who is she?" He said it loudly enough that it was clearly meant to carry. Everett looked up. "Martha Caldwell," Everett said. "My cook." "Your cook." Alderman looked toward the kitchen doorway. "Everett, I've eaten at every ranch in this county, at some point or another. I have eaten at the governor's table in Helena. I want you to understand the context of what I'm about to say." He paused. "This is the best meal I've had in the Montana Territory." The room moved not dramatically but perceptibly, like a collective breath let out. Everett looked toward the kitchen doorway. Martha was not there. She had taken 3 steps back into the kitchen proper when she'd heard Alderman's voice take on the tone it had, because she had learned, over decades, that there was a kind of comment that required her presence, and a kind of comment that was better received in her absence, and she had an instinct for which was which. She was making coffee. She heard it all clearly through the wall. Theodore Marsh said, "The gravy alone. I'd like to know what's in it." And then several people were talking at once. And Caleb's voice was in there somewhere. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different from any tone she'd heard from him in the 5 weeks since she'd arrived. She poured the coffee and kept her hands very steady. Everett came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later, when the room had settled into the post-meal conversation stage, and Heck was managing the coffee distribution. He came in and stood for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Caleb told Alderman that the meal was prepared from existing ranch stores and foraged materials because the supply wagon hasn't arrived." Martha looked up. "I told him not to," she started. "He told him, because Alderman asked specifically," Everett said. "He wanted to know whether this was," he used the phrase proper provisioning, or the cook's own resources. Caleb told him the truth. A pause. Alderman's response was that any ranch with a cook who could produce that from those conditions was a ranch worth doing business with. Martha set down the coffee pot. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had, over the years, developed a very specific interior infrastructure for managing moments that might otherwise breach something, a wall, a rerouting, a practiced detachment that got her through. She had built it from necessity, and it was solid, and she was not ashamed of it. But she was aware in this moment of pressure against that infrastructure that she had not felt in a very long time. "All right," she said. "Martha." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the prefix. He seemed to notice, and he didn't correct it. "What you did today was my job," she said, "and I nearly didn't pull it off. But you did. The wind cooperated for most of it," she said. "And Heck found the mushrooms. And old Pete knew where the row ships were. And Caleb built the fire pits correctly and moved faster on the cheese board than I expected." She picked up the coffee pot again. "I made decisions. Other people executed them. That is what actually happened." Everett looked at her for a long moment. "That's a remarkably generous account," he said. "It's an accurate account," she said. "All right." He paused. "Then I'd like to say, for the accurate record, that the decisions were the thing. The decisions were yours." She poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him. Took it, and she saw in his face the beginning of something she couldn't quite name. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but something that was both those things and something more. Something that had to do with the specific loneliness of running a large operation and making every call alone, and the rare, disorienting experience of finding that someone else had stepped into a gap you'd stopped believing could be filled. "Elsie," she said before she could think better of it. "Yes." His voice changed on the single syllable. "She's coming back," Martha said. "You should be in the kitchen more. Not to help, you'd just be in the way. But near it. She likes having you near." He absorbed this. Yes," he said. "I will." She nodded once and went back to the coffee. The afternoon unwound slowly, the way afternoons after a large meal do, conversation stretching. People moving between inside and the yard, children running in the cold and coming back and flushed and asking for more of the apple dessert, which Martha produced from the last of the apples in smaller portions that she sent out with Heck until they were gone. Theodore Marsh found her in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon. He knocked on the doorframe. She thought that was interesting, the knock, as if the kitchen were a room that required permission, and came in with his hat in his hand. He was a man of about 50, with a kind of face that revealed less than it held. He looked around the kitchen, with the assessing gaze she'd noticed through the window, and then he looked at her. "The mushroom gravy," he said. "I've had something like it in a restaurant in St. Louis. I couldn't tell you what was in it. Wild mushroom reduction," she said. "Beef stock, wild garlic, a small amount of the venison drippings for depth. Low heat for most of the day." He nodded slowly, "and the sage in the bread." "Wild sage from the south fence line," she said. "Pete, one of the ranch hands, found it. I added it to the emergency batch. We had unexpected guests this morning," she said. "I needed more bread in less time than the original recipe allowed." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been buying cattle across 4 territories for 12 years, he said. "I've eaten at a great many ranches. I've eaten at operations 10 times the size of this one." He paused. "That bread was the best bread I've eaten in the territory." Martha looked at him steadily. "The emergency batch," she said. He smiled, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Yes," he said, "the emergency batch." She turned back to the stove. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Thank you for saying so." He put his hat back on and went back to the main room, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the coffee pot and let the afternoon hold very still. By 4 o'clock, the guests were beginning to leave. Perkins' family went first, with a long ride ahead, and children who had been cheerful through the meal, but were now entering the particular exhaustion that follows too much excitement. The Harmon brothers went next, with the handshakes and non-committal pleasantries of men who kept their feelings about competitors carefully managed. Thomas Alderman left last of the main guests. He shook Everett's hand for a long time in the yard. Martha watched from the kitchen window, without intending to. She was washing, and the window was in front of her, and that was all. Couldn't hear what they were saying. But she saw Alderman gesture toward the house, and then toward the kitchen window, and then Everett nod in a specific way, and she turned back to the sink. Theodore Marsh stopped at the kitchen doorway on his way out, turned. "I'll be back in the spring," he said. "I'd like to bring 2 associates, if the Dane Ranch is hosting again." "That's a question for Mr. Dane," she said. "I'll be raising it with Mr. Dane," he said. I wanted to raise it with you first. She looked at him. Then I'll be here, she said. He nodded and left. She turned back to the washing. The yard was quiet now. The fire pits were dying down to ash wills had banked them properly. She'd confirmed that. And the cold was coming back into the air with the particular authority it had in October in Montana. Kind of cold that reminds you the season has made a decision and will not be renegotiated. She finished the last of the washing. Elsie came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the basin. Can I dry? Elsie asked. It was a full sentence. 4 words. Said without the hesitation that had been in every word for the past month, with the ease of a child who has found her way back to the ordinary mechanics of asking for things. Martha handed her a cloth. Yes, she said. They stood there in the waning afternoon light, the woman and the child, the last of the guests' noise fading from the yard and the kitchen settling around them, and Martha washed and Elsie dried, and neither of them said anything more for a while. It was enough. It was, Martha thought, exactly enough. Ply wagon arrived 6 days after the gathering. It came in on a Tuesday morning. 2 wagons, actually. The original order plus a supplementary load that the freight company had sent when the first delay extended past their guarantee window, and the yard was briefly full of the particular noise of unloading. Men calling to each other across the distance between the wagon bed and the storehouse, the thud of crates, the creak of the wagon suspension releasing weight it had held for weeks. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. She had a list in her apron pocket. She had written it 3 days after the gathering, when the shape of the winter ahead had become clearer to her, what she would need, in what quantities, to feed 30 men through Montana cold for 4 more months. The list was specific and annotated, and she intended to check every item against the delivery before she signed anything, because she had learned in a Kansas boarding house at 34 that the difference between what was ordered and what actually arrived was a problem that only compounded if you didn't catch it at the moment of delivery. Caleb was directing the unloading. He moved through the organized confusion of it with the competence she had come to recognize as his most reliable quality, purposeful, clear in his directions, wasting nothing. He had the manifest in his hand, and he was checking it against the crates as they came off, calling corrections when something was in the wrong place, keeping the movement efficient. He had been different since the gathering. Not transformed. She didn't believe in transformations. Not the sudden kind. Not in men like Caleb who had built their certainties carefully and over time. But different in the small ways that actual change happens. The way he no longer stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. The way he had started telling her things without being asked. The cattle count, the fence situation, the expected timeline for the fall work information that she had not requested but that affected her planning and that he had apparently decided she ought to have. The way he had, twice in the past week, eaten a second portion of supper without the slight tension in his jaw that used to accompany the act of enjoying something she had made. Small things. Real things. She went back inside and started the morning bread. The delivery check took 2 hours. When it was done, Martha had found 3 discrepancies, 2 items short delivered, and 1 item that arrived in a damaged condition she was not prepared to accept. She wrote the discrepancies on a separate piece of paper with the specific quantities and the expected versus delivered amounts, and she gave it to Everett with the freight company's copy of the manifest folded underneath. This needs to go back with their driver, she said. They owe us a credit or a supplementary delivery before the next run. Everett looked at the paper. You documented all this? While the unloading was happening. She had walked the crates herself, which had earned her looks from some of the men a woman moving through the working part of the yard, with a pencil and a list, checking things they were carrying. She had not paid the looks any particular attention. Caleb can handle the freight dispute. Caleb was managing the unloading, she said. I was managing the inventory. We were doing different things. This part is mine. She paused, unless you'd prefer otherwise. Everett looked at the paper again, then at her. No, he said slowly. No, I don't prefer otherwise. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. It was not a confrontation. It didn't feel like one. What it felt like was a fact being stated and then accepted, which was the best version of that kind of moment, the version where no one had to fight for what was already true. The fuller pantry changed the daily texture of her work in ways that were both practical and slightly disorienting. She had been operating under constraint for so long, 6 weeks of constant calculation, of finding the use in every forgotten corner of the cellar, of building meals from what existed rather than what was needed, that an abundance of materials initially felt strange. like a muscle that had been held tight for months, suddenly asked to relax. She had to consciously resist the impulse to ration things that no longer needed rationing, to hold back flour she now had in plenty, to save the lard that she could now replenish. The meals improved in the measurable ways that access to full resources always improves a thing. She could make what she planned instead of adapting constantly. The men ate better, not dramatically better, because they had been eating well enough for weeks, but consistently better, in the way that removes a small background tension nobody had consciously noticed. But something else happened too, which she hadn't anticipated. The men had started talking to her. Not the way they'd talked around her in the early days. The careful politeness of people who are aware they were unkind once and are now negotiating what to do with that, but actually talking. Heck had begun telling her things about the cattle work, small observations that had no purpose other than being shared. Old Pete stopped by the kitchen most mornings now, not to provide foraging information, but for coffee and the kind of quiet company that old men and practical women tend to understand without explaining. Even Wills and DuBose, who were not naturally communicative, had developed the habit of saying something specific about the meal when they finished. Not elaborate compliments, just that stew was right or good bread today. The kind of thing you only say when you mean it. She had not expected to matter to them. She had expected to be useful. She had come prepared for useful. But mattering was different, and she was aware of it in a way that made her so slightly uncertain. The way any person is uncertain when they receive something they had quietly stopped expecting to get. It was Heck who told her about the conversation in the bunkhouse. He didn't intend to tell her. It came out sideways, the way revelations do when the person carrying them hasn't decided whether to share them, but finds themselves unable to hold the weight alone. He had come into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon to return a borrowed tool, the small paring knife she'd lent him for some task he'd mentioned and she'd already forgotten, and he had set it on the table and stood there for a moment with the look of someone who has something else to say. "There's been some talk," he said finally. Martha looked up from the dough she was working. "What?" He shifted his weight. "About you and about Caleb." She waited. "Some of the men are saying," he stopped. "They're saying Caleb ought to apologize. What he said the day you arrived. The men who were there are saying it ought to be said straight." Martha kept her hands in the dough. "Who started that conversation?" she said. "I don't know exactly. It's been building since the gathering, I think." After what else he said. She thought about that. "Heck," she said. "Did any of the men come to you specifically asking you to tell me this?" He looked at his boots. "Maybe. Because if Caleb owes someone something," she said carefully, "it isn't their business to collect it. Some of them feel bad," he said. They laughed too. In the yard that first day. Most of them didn't say anything, but they laughed. Stopped working the dough. She had not forgotten the yard. She had never forgotten the yard. It was the kind of moment that lived in the specific register of memory that holds the things you can't unfeel. Not because they destroyed something, but because they named something that was already there. The particular clarity of being told, in public, what a group of people had already decided you were. "Tell them," she said, "that I'm not carrying it anymore, and that if they want to do something useful with the feeling, they can eat well and work hard and treat the next person who walks into a yard better than they treated me." Heck was quiet for a moment. He started. "That's enough," she said. "Really, it is." She went back to the dough. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it, and he was almost to the door when he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said. "I didn't laugh." She glanced up. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the doorframe, in the way people look at things that aren't what they're actually seeing. "I know," she said. "You were one of the ones who looked ashamed." He left without another word, and she heard his boots on the porch, and then on the steps, and then in the yard, and she kept working. And she thought that this was something nobody told you about the long version of surviving things. Not the dramatic part, the immediate part, the part where you are in it and have to keep moving regardless. But the long part that comes after, when other people's relationship to what happened becomes its own thing to navigate. You had to decide what to do with other people's guilt. It was its own labor, and it was real, and she had not been warned about it. Caleb came to the kitchen on a Saturday. Came in the late morning. Between the breakfast cleanup and the lunch preparation, when the kitchen was hers in the particular way, it was only between the two rushes quiet, ordered, the stove at a manageable level, her own thoughts audible for the first time in the day. He knocked on the doorframe, which he had never done before. Turned. He was standing straight, which was how he always stood, But there was something different in the arrangement of his face. A kind of effortful stillness that told her this had cost him preparation. "Do you have a minute?" he said. "I have a few," she said. She did not move toward the table. She stood where she was, dishcloth in hand, and waited. Came in and stopped near the center of the room, which was an odd place to stop. Not close enough for a conversation, not far enough to be looking at something. Just present, aware of the geometry of the situation. "What I said in the yard," he started, "when you arrived." She said nothing. I've thought about how to—" He stopped. Started again. "I was wrong. Not about the operational concern, because a cook who can't manage the volume is a real problem. And I was right to think about it. But about the way I said it, and who I said it to in front of." His jaw moved. "And I was wrong about you, specifically, which I think you know, but I want to say it directly." Kitchen was quiet. "All right," Martha said. He looked at her. "That's it? What else would you like?" she asked. Not unkindly, with genuine curiosity, I expected. He stopped. "You expected me to tell you it's fine," she said. "Or you expected me to tell you it isn't, so you could feel you'd taken your punishment." She set the cloth down on the counter. "It's neither one. What happened was what it was. You were wrong, and it hurt, and you've spent 6 weeks watching me do a job you told a yard full of people I couldn't do." She met his eyes steadily. "I think you've had your accounting. I don't need to give you one." Stood with that for a moment. "You're a harder person to apologize to than most," he said. "I'm a person who doesn't need your guilt to feel better," she said. "That's different from hard." Something in his face shifted. Not softening exactly. Because Caleb Rourke's face was not built for softening, but something in the rigid structure behind his expression rearranged itself by one small increment. "The gathering," he said. "What you did with what we had." "What we had," she said. "You built the fire pits. You moved on the cheese board without being asked twice. You told Alderman the truth when he asked about the provisions." "I wasn't going to lie to Alderman." "No," she said. "But you could have deflected. You chose not to." She picked the cloth back up. "That's the accounting I have of you. It balances." He was quiet for a long moment. "The winter's going to be long," he said finally. "The south pasture fence needs full replacement before the snow sets in. The men are going to be working long days, and they're going to come in tired and cold and needing to eat." "I know," she said. "I'll let you know the schedule in advance," he said, "when the long days are coming, so you can plan." This was, she understood, his version of the conversation, continuing in the only direction it knew how to go toward utility, toward the practical, toward the specific form of respect that showed itself through information shared and considerations made. "Appreciate that," she said. He nodded once. He left the way he'd come, and Martha stood for a moment, listening to the kitchen settle back around her, and she thought that this was what apologies actually looked like when they were real. Not the grand kind, not the kind with audiences, but the small arrived-at kind, the kind that two people find their way to after enough time has passed, that they both know what they're actually talking about. It wasn't neat, but it was honest, and honest was more useful than neat. Everett found Elsie teaching Martha something on a Wednesday afternoon. He had come looking for Martha to tell her about the change in the winter schedule, the same information Caleb had told him he would pass along, but which Everett had apparently decided to deliver himself, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and did not immediately speak, because what was happening in the kitchen made speech feel like an interruption. Elsie was standing at the preparation table, demonstrating, with considerable authority, how to fold bread dough in the method Martha had taught her. She was explaining it in the step-specific way that children explain things they have recently learned, with the particular conviction of someone who has just understood something and wants to confirm that understanding by transmitting it. Martha was listening, not performing listening, actually listening, watching Elsie's hands, asking occasional questions that were real questions. And then what? Does the direction matter? How do you know when it's enough? The way she asked Heck about the mushrooms, the way she'd asked old Pete about the land, with the complete attention that says what you know is worth my time. Everett stood in the doorway and watched his daughter talking, full sentences, unprompted, uncoaxed, with the natural rhythm of a child mid-thought, not the careful single words of the early weeks, not the cautious phrases, but actual talking, the ordinary unstoppable kind, with the slight redundancy and self-correction that living speech has when nobody is measuring it. His face did the thing it had done at the gathering table when Elsie stood up, that multiple-thing expression, that compressed interior event that had no single name. He did not go in. He stood there until Elsie finished demonstrating the fold and looked up at Martha for confirmation, and Martha looked at the dough and said, "Yes, that's right. You've got it." And Elsie looked pleased in the uncomplicated way of someone who has been told something true. Then Everett cleared his throat so they would know he was there. Elsie turned. "Papa," she said, "I know how to fold the bread now." "I saw," he said. His voice was careful. "Martha says it matters how you fold it because the air—" She glanced at Martha for the word. "Distributed," Martha supplied. "Distributed," Elsie repeated with satisfaction. "The air gets distributed, and that's why it rises right." "I didn't know that," Everett said. "Neither did I," Elsie said in a tone that implied this had recently been corrected, and he could consider himself equally corrected now. He came fully into the kitchen for the first time, without the pretext of needing something urgently. No cup of coffee, he'd mentioned. No schedule to relay, and sat at the corner of the table where he'd been sitting in the evenings. And Elsie went back to the dough, and Martha went back to what she'd been doing, and the kitchen held all three of them in its ordinary working quiet. That was how it began to be, in the weeks that followed. Not announced, not formally established, but settled into by all three of them in the gradual way that new arrangements settle when they are built from something real. The letter from the freight company arrived in the third week of November, in response to Martha's discrepancy report. She had not expected a prompt resolution. Freight companies in the territory operated on their own schedules and their own understanding of obligation, but the letter was direct. They acknowledged the short delivery on 2 items and offered a credit against the next order. The damaged goods they attributed to road conditions and indicated they were not liable under the terms of the contract. Martha read the letter twice. She was not satisfied with the damaged goods position. The contract language was the kind that sounded comprehensive but contained qualifications that, when read carefully, applied to almost any circumstance the company might want to use them to apply to. She had seen this before in the boarding house years, when suppliers learned that the people doing the ordering often didn't read carefully. She wrote back. She wrote 3 paragraphs. The first cited the specific section of the contract, and then the specific subsection that the company had apparently not referenced when making their determination. The second described, specific detail, the condition of the damaged goods, their weight, the loss in usable product, and the cost differential between what she had paid per unit and what she had been able to recover. The third was a request for compensation that was precise in dollar amount and explained in terms the company's accounting department would recognize. She gave the letter to Everett with a note explaining what she'd done and why. He read both lettersers and the freight companies, and was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn contract language?" he said. "Abilene," she said. "There was an operator there who believed that the person doing the purchasing didn't read what they signed. He was right about most people. He wasn't right about me." "You learned this when you were in Abilene." "I learned it after the first time he shorted me, and I couldn't do anything about it," she said. After that I read. Everett folded the letters. "I'll send this," he said. "There's also the question of the winter order," she said. "If we're placing one before the pass closes, it needs to go in the next 10 days. He looked up. "I hadn't thought about the pass closing," he said. "The freight driver mentioned it when he was here. He said they stop the winter run when the pass gets ice." She handed him another paper, the winter order she had prepared. "These are the quantities I'd recommend. I've tried to account for the full crew through March." He took the paper and looked at it, and she saw his eyes moving down the list with the specific attention of a man who is reading something, and also calculating costs simultaneously. He got to the bottom and back to the top. "This is thorough," he said. "It's winter in Montana," she said. "Thorough is the minimum." He almost smiled, the same almost smile she had seen before, the kind that lived mostly in the crinkle at the corner of his eye and never quite made it to his mouth in its full form. "I'll get this to the freight company today," he said. He left with both letters, and she went back to the stove. It occurred to her, somewhere around noon, that she had just managed a freight negotiation, a contract dispute, and a winter procurement order on behalf of a ranch that had not been hers when she arrived, and that she had done this as naturally as she checked the bread without deliberation, because it was simply the next thing that needed doing. She thought about that for a moment. And then the bread needed checking, and she went back to it. The freight company settled. They offered 2/3 of what she'd asked for, which she considered and then accepted, because 2/3 of a fair amount was more than the nothing that was the alternative, and she had learned not to let the perfect become the reason to forfeit the good. When the settlement letter arrived, she noted it, filed it in the kitchen's record box. She had begun keeping a record box, a small wooden crate under the lower shelf where she kept the inventory sheets, the order records, the correspondence, and moved on. Caleb found out about it from Everett. He came to the kitchen that afternoon with the specific expression of someone who has received information that they are processing against their existing model of a person. "You got money back from the freight company," he said. "Partial settlement," she said. "On the damaged delivery." "Yes." "I've been dealing with that freight company for 2 years," he said. "They've shorted us before. I sent letters." "What happened?" she said. "Nothing." She turned to look at him. "Did you cite the contract subsection?" she said. Pause. "What subsection?" He said. "I'll write it down for you," she said. "For next time." He stood there for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the frustration or the resistance or even the grudging recalibration she'd watched him navigate since the gathering. Something more straightforward than those. Something that was maybe, if she was reading it right, closer to respect without the complication. "That would be useful," he said. She wrote it down on a piece of paper that afternoon and left it on the bunkhouse table where the ranch's correspondence usually collected, because giving it to him directly would have made something of it that she didn't want to make something of. He never mentioned it again. But the next freight delivery was accurate. The evening that changed the shape of things permanently happened in early December, on a night when the snow had been falling since midday and the temperature had dropped below what the thermometer on the porch railing could reliably measure. The men had come in from the late afternoon work with the particular quality of cold that goes deeper than clothing, the cold that has been in the air long enough to find its way through wool and leather and settle in the joints. Supper had been a full beef and potato soup, which she'd been running since noon, plus the fresh bread and a jar of the plum preserves that she'd brought up from the cellar, for the specific reason that on a night like this, something sweet and summery was the right opposition to the weather. After supper, the men had stayed longer than usual. Not all of them. Some had gone to the bunkhouse. But a core of them had remained at the table, and the conversation had the loose, unhurried quality of people who have nowhere urgent to be and who are, she realized, simply comfortable where they are. Heck had started a story about a horse he'd trained 3 summers ago, and the story had grown in the telling the way stories do when the room is warm and the listeners are real, and now 4 men were involved in it, correcting and adding and arguing about details that were almost certainly not as they were being described, but which were better this way. Elsie was at the table. She had been allowed to stay up slightly later than usual. Martha had not negotiated this, but Everett had simply not sent her to bed at the regular time, and the girl had settled into the corner of the bench near her father, with the careful stillness of a child who knows they're all operating on borrowed time and is spending it wisely. She was listening to the horse story. At one point, when Heck got to the part about the horse in the creek, which was apparently the central incident and involved a great deal of gesturing, Elsie laughed. It was a small laugh, short, quickly covered by the surrounding noise. But Martha, who was moving around the periphery of the room refilling coffee cups, heard it. She did not look at Elsie. She looked at the coffee cup she was pouring and kept her hand steady and moved to the next cup, because some things are best heard without being witnessed, because being witnessed changes what they are. Everett across the table had gone very still. He recovered in a breath, and no one else seemed to have caught the significance of the small sound, or if they had understood, in the way that people who live close together develop a sensitivity for the important small moments, that it was better to let it pass without ceremony. Story continued. Elsie laughed again, louder this time at the ending. Martha was back in the kitchen doorway by then, and she saw Everett's profile, the way he looked at his daughter, the way he did not trust himself to look away from her once he had found her face. He looked like a man who had been handed something back that he had given up expecting to see again. Caleb was at the far end of the table. He looked at Elsie, and then he looked at Martha in the doorway, and something passed across his face that had no simple name acknowledgement, maybe, with all the weight that word carries, when what you are acknowledging is that you were wrong, and what you were wrong about was something that mattered, and the person you were wrong about was standing in a doorway, watching the thing she'd helped put back together hold itself up on its own. He didn't nod, she didn't nod. But the look was long enough to be a thing between 2 people, and then it was done, and Caleb turned back to the table, and Martha went back to the kitchen. It was old Pete who said it plainly, because old Pete was the kind of man who reserved words for when they were necessary, and therefore hit correctly when he used them. He came in for his morning coffee 2 days later, settled into his usual spot at the corner of the table, and looked at the kitchen with the considering expression of a man reading a landscape. "This place was going under," he said. Martha looked up. "The ranch?" she said. "Not the finances, the other part." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Part that makes a place a place. Everett was running it like a foreman instead of a man who lived here. The girl wasn't here at all, really. The men were—" He paused. "Work camps have better morale than we had in September." She didn't say anything. "I've been on this range since before Everett bought it," Pete said. "I've watched a lot of things come and go. A lot of people." He drank his coffee. "What you did, coming in here and not—" He stopped. "Started differently. Most people, when you treat them the way Caleb treated you in that yard, they either leave or they spend the whole time making sure everyone knows how they were treated." "Neither seemed useful," she said. "No," he agreed. "But that's not why most people don't do it." He looked at her directly. "Most people can't hold that much without putting it somewhere. You held it and turned it into something else." Martha sat with that for a moment. "I didn't have a choice about where I put it," she said. "I had a kitchen to run and 30 men to feed and a little girl standing in my doorway in bare feet." She picked up her own cup. "The other option was to fall apart, and I've fallen apart before. It doesn't help as much as people think it does." Pete was quiet. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it does." He finished his coffee and stood and set the cup on the table. "For what it's worth," he said, "and I don't say this kind of thing usually, you're the best cook I've eaten under, and I've eaten under a fair number." He left before she could respond, which was, she thought, the ideal Pete move, precise and complete, with no room for it to become something it didn't need to be. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. She was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 30 years in other people's kitchens, in other people's operations being useful, and then moving on, because useful was not the same as needed, and needed was not the same as belonging. And she had stopped expecting to find out what belonging felt like in the back half of her life. She looked at the kitchen, the record box under the shelf, the apron on its hook, the small stool in the corner that Elsie had dragged in from somewhere in the third week, and which had become, by unspoken agreement, Elsie's spot during the bread-making hours. She looked at all of this for a moment. And then she started the morning bread, because the bread didn't wait, and neither did any of the 31 other things she had to do before noon, and that, she thought, was its own kind of answer to the question of whether she was somewhere real. The work was real. The people the work fed were real. And she was here, doing it, which was not everything, but something, and something that had been earned through every hard morning, and every quiet calculation, and every moment she had decided not to leave, when leaving would have been easier. She was here, and that was enough for now. Winter arrived the way it always does in Montana, not with announcements, but with insistence, cold, that stopped asking permission somewhere around the second week of December, and simply moved in, settling over the range like a decision that had already been made. The Dane Ranch contracted inward the way working places do in real cold. The radius of daily life shortened. The men moved between the bunkhouse and the barn and the main house, in the purposeful head-down way of people who have learned that the distance between warm and cold is not something to philosophize about. The cattle were moved to the sheltered lower pastures. The fence work that Caleb had been driving through November was done. Mostly 2 sections of the south pasture still needed attention, but they could wait for a break in the weather that might come in February or might not come until March, and there was no point in fighting that particular calendar. Martha's days changed shape with the season. The morning start time pushed earlier because the kitchen needed to be warm before the men came in from the barn chores, and warming a kitchen in December required a longer lead than warming one in October. She was up at 3, reliably, and the stove was banked by 3:15, and by 4 the kitchen held enough heat to work in without seeing your breath. She had also, somewhere in the transition from autumn to winter, begun making a larger noon meal. It was not something she'd decided consciously. It emerged from watching, from noticing that men workings in serious cold burned through the morning meal faster than their bodies could signal it, and that by noon the hunger was a different quality than it was in milder weather, more urgent, less patient. She adjusted the portions and the composition without announcing the change, and it took approximately 4 days for the men to begin arriving at the noon table with the particular anticipation of people who know something good is coming, which told her she'd gotten it right. Caleb noticed. He mentioned it in passing, not as a compliment, which was not his mode, but as an observation. The men are working better through the afternoon, which was, she had learned, his version of the same thing. She said good, and that was the end of it. The letter from Theodore Marsh arrived in the 3rd week of December. It was addressed to Everett, but Everett brought it to the kitchen, because by then the kitchen had become the place where things were discussed, which had happened gradually and without anyone designating it, and which Martha had chosen not to examine too closely because the examination might make it self-conscious and fragile. Marsh wrote that he intended to bring 2 associates in the spring, as he'd mentioned at the gathering. He intended to look at the full Dane herd and potentially make an offer on a substantial portion of the spring calves. He also wrote, and this was the part that made Everett set the letter on the table between them, that the Dane Ranch's reputation in the territory had improved considerably since the autumn gathering, and that 3 separate conversations with neighboring ranchers had confirmed this assessment, and that he attributed much of it to the management of the household operation. Martha read the letter when Everett slid it toward her. She read it twice, which was her habit with anything significant. He's a careful writer, she said. He didn't say cook. No, Everett said. He said management of the household operation. She set the letter down. That's a spring visit, she said. I'll want to know the dates as soon as he confirms them. Course. Everett paused. Martha. She looked up at the use of her name, which still registered each time, even after weeks of him using it. I want to discuss your arrangement here, he said. Your wage and the terms. The agency terms run through spring, she said. I know. I'd like to discuss what comes after spring. She was quiet. She looked at the letter on the table, and then at the kitchen, the record box, the organized shelves, the stool in the corner, and then at Everett, who was watching her with the careful, direct attention of a man who has thought about what he wants to say and is saying it. What are you proposing, she said. A permanent position, he said. With a wage above the agency rate, I'll put the figure in writing so there's no ambiguity. Full management of the household accounts, the provisions ordering, the correspondence with the freight company. He paused. And a room in the main house rather than the outbuilding. Elsie has been, she's asked, about whether you'll stay. Martha looked at her hands on the table. She had a way of managing moments like this that she had developed over years. A practiced neutral expression, a slight pause, the appearance of consideration even when she had already felt the answer move through her, like something finally fitting into a space that had been shaped for it. She used this now, not because she was uncertain, but because the moment deserved a breath before she answered. I'll want to review the terms before I agree to anything, she said. Course, he said, and I have some conditions of my own. He nodded slowly. Tell me. Full authority over the kitchen provisioning, with no approval required for orders under a set amount that we agree on. She kept her voice even and her list clear. Access to the household accounts. Not approval of them, but access, so I understand the full picture. And the room should be the one at the back of the house, with the south window, because I'm up at 3 in the morning, and I don't want to wake anyone moving through the hall. Everett had been listening with the expression of a man who is surprised by the specificity and is trying not to show it. The back room with the south window, he said. The light is better for reading in the evening, she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, all of that is reasonable. Good, she said. Then I'll stay. He let out a breath that was slow enough to tell her he had been holding something. Not just across this conversation, but across the weeks since the gathering, maybe longer. And the release of it was quiet and real. Good, he said. She picked up the Marsh letter and began thinking about the spring menu. Christmas came, and with it the particular challenge of making something celebratory from a winter-depleted pantry that was, thanks to the October order, considerably better stocked than it had any right to be. She had planned for Christmas 2 weeks out, not the meal specifically, that she could design closer, but the category of problem, because Christmas in a working ranch in December was less about celebration in the formal sense, and more about the human need for a single day to feel different from the others, to be reminded that the calendar has not completely surrendered to the relentless practical demands of winter work. She made a proper roast. She had been saving the best cut for this, setting it aside in the cold box since the November delivery, against Caleb's early and now abandoned impulse to use everything immediately, and she brought it out the morning of the 25th and treated it the way it deserved to be treated, seasoned properly, rested before and after heat, cooked low and slow in the oven with the wild garlic butter she'd been holding, and a handful of the dried mushrooms from Heck's Finds. She made a pie. This was the thing she had been most concerned about, because pie requires certain materials specifically, a good fat for the crust, and fruit of some kind, and both were finite. She had the lard. For the fruit, she used the preserved plums and the dried apple rings together, which was not traditional, but which she had tested on a small scale 2 weeks prior, and which produced something that was its own thing, rather than a failed version of either option. Elsie helped with the pie crust. She had graduated, over the weeks, from stirring and measuring to actual construction. The press and fold of the dough, the way you had to keep your hands cold to do it right, the moment when you knew the fat had distributed properly, and the texture shifted. Martha had not designed a curriculum. She had simply kept inviting Elsie into the work, and then trusted the girl to find her own level in it, which had turned out to be higher and faster than Martha had expected. Elsie pressed the crust into the pan on Christmas morning with the focused competence of someone who has done a thing enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics and start thinking about the outcome. "Is it too thick here?" she asked, pointing to the edge. Martha leaned in and looked. "Little bit," she said. "Work it back toward the center." Elsie adjusted slowly, deliberately. "Better?" "Yes," Martha said. The girl straightened and looked at the crust with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has fixed the thing they spotted wrong, without being told twice, and Martha thought, not for the first time, that this child was going to be formidable at whatever she decided to do when she was grown, because she had the specific combination of attention and stubbornness that turns ordinary capability into something else. "Martha," Elsie said, "yes. Are you going to stay?" She asked it directly, the way children ask things that adults spend weeks building up to sideways. Papa said maybe. After the spring. Martha was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to stay," she said. Elsie looked at the pie crust. "Good," she said, evenly, like she'd confirmed something she'd already decided was true, and was simply completing the accounting. Then she picked up the rolling pin and started on the top crust. Martha went back to the roast. She was aware, in the particular way she'd been aware of things since arriving at the Dane Ranch always, slightly tilted toward the emotional register, always noting the human weight of moments that the practical surface of things carried without advertising, that she had just made a promise to a child, which was different from making it to Everett, different from deciding it herself in the abstract. Promise to a child was a different kind of thing. It had a different gravity. She had made very few of them in her life, because she had understood, even in her 20s, that you did not make them unless you were certain. She was certain. She turned back to the roast and adjusted the oven damper, and outside the kitchen window the snow came down in the deliberate, unhurried way of a Montana December that has nowhere to be and all winter to get there. Christmas meal was the fullest the ranch table had been since the gathering. All the men came, even the two who usually ate quickly and disappeared, who had, over the weeks, been pulled back by degrees into the gravitational field of the kitchen's particular warmth. Everett sat at the head of the table with Elsie beside him, and the girl sat with the comfort of someone who has decided this is her place at the table, and is no longer checking to see if the decision will hold. Old Pete said, when the roast came out, that it was the finest piece of beef he had eaten in 20 years. Heck, with the characteristic forthrightness that had become one of the things Martha valued about him, said, "In your life, Pete. Say in your life." Pete considered this with appropriate gravity. "Possibly in my life," he allowed. The table laughed. A real laugh. The kind that doesn't require a setup or a punchline, that emerges from people who are comfortable enough with each other to find the small things funny without explanation. Caleb was at the far end of the table, as had become his custom foreman's position, slightly removed from the center of the social noise, which suited his nature. He ate with the quiet concentration he brought to everything, and when Martha sent the second tray of bread down the table, and it reached him, he took a piece and ate it with the lack of ceremony of a man who has stopped performing indifference and arrived at its genuine opposite. After the meal, when the table was clearing, and the afternoon light was going gray through the windows, he found Martha in the kitchen. "I'm leaving in the spring," he said. She turned. He was standing at the doorway in the way he'd stood on the first morning she'd seen him, arms at his sides this time, not crossed, and his expression was the even, resolved expression of someone who has made a decision over a long period and has arrived at the telling of it without drama. "Where are you going?" she said. "There's an operation in Wyoming. Bigger herd, different kind of management challenge. I've been in correspondence with the owner since September. Before the gathering then. Before everything." "Everett knows," she said. "Not a question." He's known since November. I wanted to tell you separately. She looked at him. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him find the answer, not construct it, but find it, which was the difference between a man managing an impression and a man telling the truth. Because you deserve to know from me directly, he said. Not from Everett, not from the table. From me. He paused. What happened when you arrived? I don't expect that to be settled. I know it isn't, but I wanted to say face to face that you were... He stopped, restarted. I watched you save this ranch. Not the herd, not the accounts. The thing that makes a ranch worth saving. And I watched you do it without making it about what I'd said to you in that yard. He met her eyes. I have not met many people who could do that. Martha looked at him for a long moment. You're a capable man, Caleb, she said. You were wrong about me, and you've been man enough to sit with that. That's not nothing. It's the minimum, he said. You'd be surprised, she said. How many people don't manage the minimum? He nodded once. The new foreman Everett's considering, he said. Not my concern, she said. That's between you and Everett. I recommended he look at Wills, he said. I wanted you to know that. Wills listens. He'll work with you instead of around you. She absorbed this. Thank you, she said. He picked up his hat from the counter. He'd set it there when he came in, which was something he'd started doing, and which she'd never remarked on, but which she'd noticed, because it was the small gesture of someone who has decided they are entering a room rather than inspecting it. It's been he started. It has, she said. He went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after his boots were gone from the porch, and she thought about what it cost a man like Caleb Rourke to walk into a room and say the things he had said, and she thought that people were almost always more complicated than the worst moment you'd witnessed of them, and that the worst moment was almost never the whole accounting, and that this was both a useful thing to know and an exhausting one, because it required you to keep looking even when what you'd already seen made you want to stop. She had kept looking. She didn't regret it. January moved through the ranch with a grinding, patient severity that Martha had been warned about, but which still, in its actual presence, exceeded the warning. Cold was the kind that had texture, that you could feel as resistance in your hands when you worked, that made iron stiff and water reluctant and everything material slightly less willing to cooperate than it had been in October. The men came in from morning chores with the look of people who have been somewhere real and are readjusting to the relative luxury of a room with a stove. Martha had adjusted the meals again heavier, more fat, more caloric density per portion, because the cold was burning it out of them faster than she could replace it if she didn't account for the rate. She had read about this somewhere. Years ago, a pamphlet about expedition nutrition, of all things, that she'd found in a general store in Abilene and read out of boredom and retained out of the specific habit she had of storing useful things without immediately knowing why they were useful. Now she knew why Elsie was sick for a week in January. Not dangerously sick, a chest cold, the kind that children get, and that produces more drama than actual danger, with a cough that sounded worse than it was and a fever that came and went and mostly went. But it removed her from the kitchen, and Martha found that the kitchen's rhythm was different without her. Smaller, not diminished exactly, but differently shaped, the way a room changes when a particular piece of furniture is moved. Not worse, but noticeably altered. She sent food to Elsie's room. Not the regular meals which Everett carried up, but specific things. A small pot of broth made with the last of the dried mushrooms and a good long simmer. A piece of the bread she'd made, soft and close crumbed, because the cough made it harder to swallow. A small dish of the plum preserves, because Elsie liked them, and because sick children needed things they liked more than they needed things that were optimal. On the fourth day, Elsie sent a message back with her father. Everett appeared in the kitchen doorway in the late afternoon, with the expression of a man delivering something both small and significant. She wants to know, he said, if she can have a piece of regular bread instead. She says the soft bread is for babies. Martha looked up. Tell her she can have regular bread when she stops coughing through the night, she said. Everett's expression contained something that was not quite a smile, but was in the general territory of one. Going to negotiate, he said. I know, Martha said. Tell her anyway. He went back upstairs, and Martha heard, faintly through the ceiling, the sound of a conversation happening. Not the words, just the shape of it. The back and forth that told her Elsie was arguing her case with the full force of a child who has rediscovered the mechanics of language and is now deploying them at full capacity. She was not going to get the regular bread until Thursday. But Thursday she got it, and she came downstairs herself to collect it. wrapped in a blanket that dragged on the floor. With the slightly aggrieved triumph of someone who has won a negotiation they're not entirely sure was worth having. Stood at the kitchen counter and ate the bread and did not cough once. Martha watched her from the corner of her eye and said nothing and kept working, and thought that there was something specifically good about being allowed to be the person who held a line with the child and had it hold. February brought the break in the weather that Caleb had said might come. A full week of comparative warmth that allowed Wills, who had in fact been offered and accepted the foreman position, with a quiet competence that suggested he'd been ready for it, to get the last 2 sections of South Pasture Fence done. It also brought a second letter from Theodore Marsh, confirming the spring visit for the 3rd week of April and naming his associates, a rancher from Colorado and a banker from Kansas City who, Marsh wrote, had been hearing reports about the Dane Ranch operation and were interested in what they'd heard. Martha read the letter 3 times, reports, plural, from multiple sources. She set the letter down and thought about the autumn gathering, an alderman's voice carrying through the main room, and the Perkins woman saying something to her husband before she'd even sat down. She thought about the fact that information moves through a territory the same way water does, finding the low points and the channels, and traveling whether you direct it or not, and the question is only whether what travels is true. What had traveled apparently was true. She began planning the April meal the following morning. Not because April was close, it wasn't not yet, but because the planning itself was useful, the way any early work is useful when you know something large is coming. It gave the future a shape you could work toward, rather than a cliff you were walking toward blind. Planned differently than she had in October. October had been survival improvised into excellence. April would be something she could build from the beginning, with full stores, with the foraged knowledge that old Pete and Heck had given her, with the understanding of what the land around the Dane Ranch actually offered to someone who knew how to look. She would use the wild garlic again, because it had been the thing that made the difference in the bread, and she had been thinking about other applications for weeks. She would plan around the spring calves, not using the ranch's own, which had commercial value, but sourcing young cuts from the neighboring operations, as she had heard other ranch cooks do when they wanted variety outside their own stock. She would do the mushroom gravy again, because Marsh had asked about it specifically, which meant it had reached him in the particular way that food reaches people when it has genuinely moved them. And she would make something new. She didn't know what yet. But she had learned, over 30 years of feeding people in hard places, that the best meals always contained one thing that surprised you. One decision you made 3 days before that turned out to be the thing people were still talking about a month later. You could not plan the surprise. You could only stay open to it, keep your eyes on the materials you had, and trust that the idea would arrive if you were paying attention. She was always paying attention. March came in wet and stayed that way, which was, Wills told her, a good sign for the spring grass, but a bad sign for anyone who needed dry roads before May. Kitchen had become, through the winter, a place that people moved toward, not just the ranch hands, though they had by February developed the specific gravitational relationship to the kitchen that people develop when a place has been reliably warm and reliably good across enough dark mornings that the association is now involuntary. But Everett, too, who had made a habit of the evening coffee, and Elsie, who spent her afternoons there as a matter of course, and old Pete, whose morning visits had become the structure around which Martha organized the first hour of her day. Even Will's different from Caleb in almost every register, quieter, less armored, with the listening quality that Caleb had mentioned and that Martha had confirmed was accurate, had begun asking questions about the meals in advance. Not to manage them, just to know. To understand what was coming the way a man who respects a process wants to understand its shape before it arrives. Martha answered his questions without making anything of them, because making something of it would have changed its nature. She thought often about the way the ranch had been when she arrived. Not with nostalgia, she didn't traffic in nostalgia for other people's circumstances, but as a reference point. Cold yard, the empty shelves. Caleb's voice carrying across the dust like something thrown. She thought about what she had known, in that moment, that no one else in the yard had known, which was that you cannot tell what a person is capable of from the outside, and that the outside is all that most people ever look at, and that this is not simply an error of judgment, but a failure of imagination, the refusal to ask the question, what might be in there that I cannot see? She had been on the wrong side of that failure her entire life. The size of her body, the plainness of her presentation, the accumulated wear of decades of hard work that sat on her in ways that the young and the comfortable read as diminishment. All of it had been used, by person after person, as evidence of what she was not, what she could not do, what she was not worth. And she had never been able to make them see differently by arguing. Argument didn't work. Explanation didn't work. The only thing that had ever worked, the only thing she had ever found that moved the needle on what people were willing to believe about her, was the meal on the table in front of them, the warmth in the room around them, evidence that could not be dismissed because it was already inside them before they thought to resist it. You could not tell people who you were. You had to build the thing and let them live in it and wait for them to understand that you had built it. Longer, it cost more. It required a patience that she had not chosen so much as been broken into over the years, the way a trail is worn into a hillside, not because someone decided it should go there, but because someone kept walking that way until the ground finally gave. She had kept walking, and here was where the path had led. The evening the story completed itself, or found the shape it would hold going forward, which is the closest that real lives get to completion, was a night in late March, kind of night that announces spring is possible even if it hasn't quite committed. The temperature had risen enough that the men came in from the evening chores without the stamped-down inward quality they'd had through January and February. The supper was a lamb stew. Wills had sourced 2 young animals from the Perkins operation, the beginning of a spring exchange arrangement that Martha had proposed and that had been agreed to with less negotiation than she'd expected. And the kitchen smelled like the particular combination of things that does not have a single name but that almost everyone responds to in the same direction. Toward warmth, toward the table, toward the idea of enough. Old Pete was in his usual corner. Heck was at the near end of the table telling Dubose something about a horse he'd seen at the Perkins place, which sounded implausible, but was delivered with the conviction that Pete had taught Martha to associate with things that were probably true. Wills was at the foreman's end, not Caleb's end. She thought of it now already. It had already become Wills's end, which was how replacement actually happens. Not in the announcement, but in the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments. Everett came in from the study, and Elsie was already at the table, and they sat together in the corner way that had become their particular arrangement, close but not touching. Specific proximity of a father and daughter, who have remembered how to be in the same room, and are still sometimes surprised by the ease of it. Martha brought the stew out and set it at the center of the table, stood back. In the peripheral space she had always occupied at meals, not seated with them, not entirely absent. Present in the way that the person responsible for a thing is always present in it, even when they step back, and she looked at the table. 30 men and a rancher and his daughter, in the warmth, at the end of a cold day, at the end of a long winter, at the beginning of a spring that was almost but not quite here. Old Pete looked up from his bowl and found her across the room. He raised his coffee cup slightly, just that. No words. Just the small gesture of a man who knows that some acknowledgments don't need to be elaborated. She gave him the smallest nod. Across the table, Elsie said something to her father that made him laugh, actually laugh, with sound. The laugh of a man who has remembered that he has this function. And Heck looked up from his horse story to see what was funny. And Dubose was already smiling, and the room held all of this with the ordinary ease of a place that has found its shape. Martha turned back to the kitchen. There were dishes to manage, and the morning bread to plan, and the April menu to continue thinking about, and 30 years of work behind her, and however many years of it ahead of her, and none of that was simple or finished or as good as it was going to be. But she was here, in a kitchen she had built into something, in a house that had learned to be a home again because she had refused, on a cold October afternoon in a dusty yard, to let one man's verdict be the last word about who she was and what she was worth. She had not fought for it. She had not argued for it. She had simply kept working, kept feeding, kept showing up in the morning before anyone else, and staying past the point where anyone was watching, kept giving the work the same care on the worst days that she gave it on the best, because that was the only standard she had ever known how to hold. And the work had told the truth about her, slowly, the way all honest work does not loudly, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of detail after detail that adds up, eventually, to something no one can dispute. She had not needed them to see her. She had needed them to see the bread, stew, the warmth, the child at the table talking to her father. She had needed them to live inside what she built long enough to understand that someone had built it, and that the someone was her. That was the thing about being underestimated. It was painful, and it was real, and it never stopped being unfair. But the answer to it was never in the argument. The answer was in the work. The long, unspectacular, repeated, daily work that most people never see, and that adds up, over time, to something that cannot be taken back. She had been doing that work her whole life. And finally, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the long, cold months, and the yard full of laughter, and the years behind her that would always be the price of what she knew finally. It had landed somewhere it could stay. She put the last of the evening's dishes on the shelf. Through the kitchen window, the March sky held a faint and preliminary warmth along the western edge. Not quite spring, not quite winter. The threshold between things where the air hasn't decided yet, but is leaning. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She went to the back room with the south window. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet have the room for a moment, just the sounds of the house settling into the night, the low voices from the bunkhouse, the wind finding the familiar gaps in the eaves, the distant sound of Elsie being sent upstairs, the slight protest, the second sending. Martha Caldwell was 51 years old, and she had spent the better part of 3 decades in other people's kitchens, in other people's places, being useful and then moving on because useful was not the same as belonging. And she had, without planning it, without expecting it, without entirely recognizing it, until it was already true stopped moving on. She had built something, and this time it was also hers.